Chapter 22. The Lioness. Even so early in the morning, it proved difficult to reach the port. More red-cloaked men and women blocked most of the main paths, and unlike the ones wandering the town, these soldiers were fully armored with their weapons drawn. They stood resolutely, staring forward unless they were turning someone away from entering the area or scrutinizing the horizon of the Fourth Sea. "Like they own the city," Anselm hissed as they all halted 30 paces off from the entryways to the port. They all huddled close, and Leothran, still veiled with her cowl, slipped behind them all into the shadow of an overarching face of a building. The road they stood on was wide and full of traffic. It was the main road that cut through the center of Shorewell from the town square, heading east until the cobblestone suddenly turned to grass where they now stood. Only a short distance further was a clump of tall buildings, mostly constructed of aging and mossy elder wood that overlooked the ocean, and beyond them, a dozen enormous docks of similar build. About half of the docks were occupied, with only one meager ship bearing the insignia of Manon, the mighty hentock sea beast, lord creature of the ocean deeps. The remaining docks held the vessels of the unexpected visitors from Talgarth, with the empty areas reserved for the rest of the Queen's fleet. At the command of their overseers, enemy workers were moving boxes and rolling barrels, tying ropes and readying the ramps for disembarking. Shorewell was a city of no small size, but Talgarth was pushing it to the limits of its capacity. People trying to walk by the guards posted near the buildings where the port began to sprout were turned away except for a few laborers carrying loads or Shorewell sailors on their own business. "There's no chance of getting past all of that," Elastra said. "We'd be under the axe in minutes." Damon pulled his feathered hat down low over his eyes as he turned back to them. "I do not think we will have to. Standing right on top of the docks themselves would be too close for us. Nowhere to go if something goes amiss." "Amiss?" Anselm said. "What exactly do you expect to go amiss?" "Nothing in particular," the old man responded. "But this is the Queen and her closest advisors we are dealing with. We must take the greatest caution." "What about up there?" Layla said. She was pointing off to the left of the port, where a group of tall, thin buildings sat peeking over a thick log fence. Most of them had open balconies and large arched roofs, and the middle tallest building stretched up, topped with a large rusting bronze bell. "Yes, excellent, Layla," Damon said. "That would be perfect," Caleb agreed. "Those buildings aren't even part of the port, and the fence around them will keep immediate danger away. We'll be able to see above the crowds as well." "Those buildings are clearly being used by the enemy," Elastra said with a grimace. "Let's hope the men posted there are less abrasive than they are here. I don't think we have any other options open to us." The others glanced around as well. To their right, the grassy ground stretched on flatly, and the rest of the expanse of the port was blocked off by another stone wall, making the way immediately before them the only entrance. They backtracked and followed the fence around to the tall buildings, but as they came around the last corner they were disappointed to see a group of 4 ghouls sitting on the stairs in front of the large double doors, laughing and hitting each other. They were wearing breastplates with the crimson sun painted on them, but their legs and feet were bare save for furs around their waists, and spears rested casually against their shoulders. "I suppose this would make a good place for an assassin to send an arrow from the window," Caleb said. "I'm sure they have it all well guarded inside as well as out. We should expect guards wherever we go today." They all moved deeper into the shadows of the adjacent building. Damon threw the bag he had carried on his back since they left the anchor onto the ground, and pulled the string that held it shut. "Well then, we will just have to be guards as well," he said. He pulled from the large sack 3 red cloaks. They were hooded, and each of them had the emblem of the sun sewn on the back. Caleb tried to see the other things hidden inside, but his father pulled the string tight again and returned the bag to his shoulder. He stood up straight and held them out. "I'm afraid there are not enough for all of us. Though not the most convincing disguises, they'll be quite sufficient to fool those foul creatures. We should be grateful men are not keeping watch." "No thank you," Anselm said with a look of disgust. "Any of you fine people will fit into those things better than I." Leothran and Elastra also showed disinterest, and at length, Caleb, his father, and Layla pulled the red cloaks over the ones they were wearing, and bound them up so that nothing beneath could be seen. The other three waited and watched with interest from the corner as they made their way toward the group of ghouls. As they approached, the one that was seemingly in charge stood up and crossed his arms in the Talgarth salute, pounding the butt of his polearm on the stone. "Hail!" the creature started with a voice that sounded like a fatal disease. "Nobody enters by order of." "We are to take up watch on the second floor to relieve the men there," Damon said, cutting him short. "Stand aside." The ghoul was confused and intimidated by Damon's gruff frankness, as were the other three who stood at attention like statues to the side of him, but the leader shifted his feet and croaked a sharper response. "Humans always be thinking they have more authority, but orders are orders. We were commanded not to let anyone pass." Damon glared down at him, and the ghoul attempted to sound braver. "Get you tall-legged humans. This is our post, so you dare question the—" Damon started, but surprisingly Layla stepped forward with venom in her voice. "Why, you filthy wretches," she said. She came at the leader with clenched fists, and Caleb could tell she was not acting. "You don't even belong in this city, or any city for that matter. So you be gone and slither back to your holes in the mountains, or I'll gut you like a fish myself." The ghoul had stumbled backward with wide eyes, surprised to see a woman shouting the commands, while the others shuffled off to the sides of the doors. The leader ghoul showed signs of opposition by placing both hands on his spear, and Caleb was ready to step in to protect Layla, but he was surprised again when she drew her short sword and pointed it at him. "Try it," she snapped. The ghoul spit at her feet, and scurried away under the pretense of rounding up his guardsmen, who were now disappearing into the crowds nearby. Layla turned around and sheathed her weapon, still bearing a scowl of hot anger. When she looked up and saw Caleb and his father watching with wide eyes, she shook her head. "I'm sorry. I was not thinking," she said. "I just could not stand it a minute longer." "It should not cause too much trouble, I think," Caleb said with an amused smile. "Indeed," Damon said. "But we had best get inside now before that scene is all for naught." They opened the doors and dashed inside. Once they had checked the entrance hallway for any other unwanted observers, Caleb signaled to the others who were still watching from across the road to follow, while his father ran up the nearby staircase as silently as a cat to scout ahead. "Well done, Layla," Anselm chuckled as soon as they had shut the heavy wooden doors. "Could not have done a worthier job myself." The main level was small and barren of any furniture, with Talgarthian gear and half-eaten food strewn here and there. Damon appeared again at the top of the stairs. "Hurry," he said. "I have found a suitable room for us up above. More soldiers will be here long before the Queen arrives, but I will serve as our door watch. Follow me." They all followed him up the stairs, catching views of the harbor and ocean beyond through the windows going up. There were still no ships in sight as far as Caleb could tell, which told him their expected visitors from the east were still hours away at least. He led them down the only hall on the second level parallel to the one below, and past another staircase that rose higher yet and steeper still to the top where the bell hung. He brought them to the end of the hall where a large window faced the sea, and opened the door to his right. They all filed in and found they were in some sort of resting quarters, perhaps meant for the bell ringer. There was a single small bed on one side, and a clothes chest and stool. The stone floor was carpeted by a large thin rug with dull colors. On the side facing the port, the wind blew lightly colored curtains that served as a door for the small balcony that jutted 10 paces out from the structure. Sunbeams danced onto their faces each time the wind caught the curtains. "This should provide us with a clear view and will be as safe as any place we can find," Damon said, throwing his bag on the ground. Caleb took off his Talgarth cloak and tossed it to him. Layla did likewise, but instead of putting them away, he draped them over the nearby clothes chest. "We may need these yet if my act of keeping watch in the hall goes awry," he said. "Be ready for anything today." They were all casually exploring the room and cautiously looking at the view from the windows, but turned in unison as Damon unfastened the sword from his belt. The hallowed somehow looked more glorious as it emerged from under his shrouds and into the bathing sunlight. He took it across the room and placed it gently on the bed. "This would likely raise suspicion," he said with a small grin. "Keep an eye on it while I stand guard. By the second watch of the day these shores will be filled with invaders, and the port full of unwanted guests. Let us stay here until then, out of sight." With that he was out the door. They were all still looking at the weapon, but Caleb was the first to turn away. In his youth, he had often stolen peeks at the sword under the floorboards of his father's room, and imagined the heroic deeds that accompanied it. That was before he knew better. The magic vanished quickly in the inconsistent accounts of his father's adventures. "How is it that your father came into possession of the hallowed?" Leothran asked with awe. She had removed her cloak, and was standing close to the sword with a hand hovering over it, not wanting to touch but certainly entertaining the thought. Caleb sighed. "It was given to him by King Hallis when he was a young man," he responded, leaning against a wall. "After he was made a knight and taken in by the king. Elastra mentioned before that he slew a dark sage. You must be referring to the incident 30 years ago in the Esterlands." Caleb nodded, and she shook her head in amazement. "Amongst my people we call him Mesterol, the hero of the West. And you, Caleb, are his son. Fate has truly brought me into great company," she said. Caleb waved the words away. "You are in the company of no one but a captain of Tritus. I carry the undeserved fame by lineage only." "It was 27 years ago to be exact," he replied, looking out at the sea. "My father was great, a hero to many. And my mother also. But I am just a soldier of Avondale. One has to earn a legend like his." Leothran smiled at his humility. "Where is your mother?" she asked. "If I may be so bold." "She died of complications when I was born, around the same time my father set out to face the dark sage," Caleb answered in a tone that suggested little emotion. "I am sorry," Leothran said as she tapped her forehead with 2 fingers. "May fate keep her in his hand." "Think nothing of it. I never knew her. My parents took care of him while Damon was away on his conquest," Layla said. She had taken a seat on the stool but pulled it closer to the bed, where the group had gathered. "I wasn't born yet, but my older brothers remember it." Caleb noticed her expression change for a moment as she thought of her brothers, and he hoped they were faring well in the aftermath of the battle. "Caleb's father knew my parents long before we were born. Sir Damon has practically been a second father to me throughout the years." Leothran had not taken her eye off of the weapon as she listened, but when the room grew silent again, she pulled free of her trance and turned to Anselm and Elastra. "And the 2 of you also have lived in Tritus for so long?" Elastra chuckled. "Not at all," she said. She was about to elaborate but stopped short. Anselm read her easily. "Come now, El. If you don't trust Leothran by now, I don't know how to convince you." "Oh, I trust her," Elastra said, seeming to decide right then and there. "We come from Paladar in Faldesia, the kingdom northwest of Manon. But our childhood was hardly legendary. And you wouldn't be able to recall half of it even if you tried," Anselm jabbed. Elastra looked irritated but did not deny his claim. Hours passed by, and they all grew silent as the noises outside slowly increased with activity. They had all watched the preparations unfold over the fence for a while, but eventually they all scattered to rest. Layla had fallen asleep on the stool with her back against the stone wall. Anselm was reading back in his records, and grinning occasionally as he recalled some lost memory. Somehow he had convinced his sister to write. She had moved the sword on the bed off to the side and was laying on her stomach in its place, scribbling with her brother's ink and pen in a small tarnished book crammed with loose pages, her long blonde hair veiling her face. The only sound in the room was a light rattle that came from the sill of a closed window near the door. Leothran sat there with one of her swords resting horizontally on her knee, and was running a small sharpening stone up its blade, stopping every 3 strokes to inspect it awkwardly with her single eye. Caleb broke the peace when he alerted them of the movement below. "Everyone. Ships on the horizon." They all jumped up and followed him to the balcony, each taking their turn to peer out and see the 4 shapes swaying about an hour out to sea. Already, they could tell that the ships were of considerable size. Layla was last to join them as she rubbed the sleep from her eyes. She peered down over the fence at the street below. Hordes of people thronged the entire vicinity, talking and standing on their toes to see over each other and blocking the sun out of their vision. Banners of the Crimson Sun flew proudly on the buildings near the wall, and countless other ribbons and flags hung all over the thick wooden posts at the docks, making it all a colorful welcome fit for the Queen. Soldiers of higher rank, both man and gruel, lined each of the wooden bridges that thrust out into the sea, all of whom were lined up in an orderly formation to assist with the ship's arrivals. One in particular, the centermost vacant dock, was adorned with twice the amount of banners and decorations, and a group of trumpeters stood at the ready to blast their instruments. A dozen other Talgathian leaders walked amongst the crowd, some among their ranks doing inspections, others closer to the townsmen checking for weapons and suspicious characters or pushing the more eager onlookers further back into the crowd. Just as Caleb was beginning to wonder how his father was faring out in the hall, the door opened and Damon stepped in, shutting it behind him quietly. "The time has come," he said. "The Queen of Talgarth is here." He walked over to where Alastra had placed his sword beside the bed and stopped, looking at it with a blank stare. He slowly bent down and took it up. He drew the blade halfway out of its sheath. It glittered in the light like always, and he stared at it in deep thought. Caleb saw the strange sadness fill his eyes. Caleb had often seen this look when his father thought he wasn't watching. Damon soon nodded to himself and replaced the sword to his side, hiding it once more under his red cloak. "How is our cover at the doors?" asked Caleb. "There are enough invaders down there to swarm an anthill." "We've no need to worry about that," Damon said as he cracked the closed window and looked out to the ocean. "I have 20 men under the impression that I am their overseer watching the main doors downstairs. I just heard their latest report and I've locked them out. Besides, they are too distracted by trying to get a look at their queen themselves. We will be safe for the time being." "What's the plan then?" Alastra asked as they all made their way from the balcony back into the room and out of sight. She stretched and pulled her boots tighter. "This is the perfect place to rain fire down onto that witch. One well-aimed hex and she would be trounced before she knew what hit her." "No," Damon said sharply. After a pause he continued, "We must do nothing of the sort, Sage Alastra. She will likely be well protected by wardens of her own, and even if she was not, such rashness would not only seal your doom but that of us all and the city of Shorewell. No, we watch and see what we can." It was midday, close to the beginning of the third quarter, when the ships drew close enough to make out their details. They were gargantuan, painted black with 3 masts each, the Crimson Sun painted clear and plain on each of their sails. The horns blew from the shore in a welcoming bellow, and an answer echoed back from the rear of each ship in turn. Their attention was drawn away from the ships, when the crowd below parted to make way for a small band of soldiers riding in on horseback and surrounded by a circle of spearmen. Caleb immediately recognized the one leading the procession. It was a large man wearing heavy silver armor with a helmet that bore a ghastly skeletal grin and a pair of uprising horns. He rode on a horse of beastly size that hung its head as though it were ashamed. "Lord Marmius, I assume," Anselm said. He had heard the description from many since the attack and again from Leothran, but this was the first time he or his sister had actually seen him. Behind him rode the 2 others Leothran had described on the way south, the half-man, half-gruel particularly drawing their attention. His bulky and pale mass of a body, topped with wiry black hair, was enough to make them cringe even from that distance. Layla's eyes, however, locked onto the man riding beside him. He had dark hair that reached his shoulders and a pointed nose and wore stately garb that if not for the red cloak would have seemed almost regal. Her eyes grew, and she took a dangerous step forward to get a better look before Caleb took her by the arm to gently pull her back. "What is it?" "No," Layla stammered. "It cannot be." "Layla?" "Caleb, that's him," she hissed. "Who?" "The man from my dream. That man there beside the half-gruel. I am sure of it." The others were looking at her, confused, and turned back to the crowd trying to spot the one she was referring to. What dream?" Anselm asked. Layla realized she had spoken in her surprise, and looked at a loss of what to say. Caleb knew she would feel foolish explaining herself, so he took the liberty, all the while following the man with his eyes with bewilderment in his voice. "The night we first saw the tall stalker in the forests, Layla had a strange dream and saw that man. She has had others since then, and always he is there. Isn't that right?" She nodded and looked quite shaken. I was sure he was only a creation of my mind, but how can this be? How? She trailed off again. I must be mad. He was amongst the men who held me captive, Leothrin said as she peered out onto the street from behind them all. He is the one I spoke of before, who comes from the Estelans. Palson, the Talgothians called him. You are sure that is he? Caleb asked again in utter bafflement. She nodded emphatically, but was still watching him closely as he made his way through the throng toward the docks. So you're telling me that you've seen this man in your dreams, though you have never met him before? Elastra asked sardonically. How is that even possible? I do not know, Elastra, Layla answered sharply. But it was him. That much is sure. Damon had been listening quietly from within the room. His hat was pulled down low again, shading his eyes, and he pulled at his beard pensively. As Talgarth advances into our midst, inexplicable events grow more and more common. He was muttering so much that they almost couldn't discern his words. He shook his head after a moment and looked up at Layla. A most peculiar tale, he stated in a less than encouraging tone. And yet I believe you. In my experience I have learned to regard nothing as impossible, though I fear answers to this riddle are beyond our reach for the present time. Layla's strange revelation shrouded the room with a heavy air of uneasiness, and all of them fell silent. They watched the group move on with a curious eye until the next clump of men followed after them, also on horseback, but bearing expressions of concern rather than pride. Damon explained that it was the mayor of Shorewell who lived in Flagstaff Manor in the middle of town, and his advisors pointing out one elderly man in particular called Julam. He was the highest-ranking military figure in the city. They watched over the next half hour as the ships docked and were tied, ramps were set up and people disembarked. First came a wave of red-clad soldiers from all of the ships. When Lord Marmius had exchanged formalities with other officers that emerged from the vessels, all of the number that belonged to Talgarth parted into a certain formation to create a wide path going from the center ship all the way out of the port and into the city. They lined up shoulder to shoulder, 4 men deep, making a human wall along the path plated with shields and swords. When the trumpets burst out an exultant string of notes again, all went silent. It was time. Caleb saw Lord Marmius dismount and leave the group behind. The rest followed his lead and moved off to the side in a neat line. Marmius walked to the bottom of the ramp that led to the deck of the central ship, and dropped to one knee, the others following his actions again. A tall, straight figure appeared on deck, arising from somewhere in the hull. A woman! She moved slowly as if half asleep down the ramp and raised Lord Marmius. The representatives of Shorewell stood some distance away unacknowledged. Caleb and his companions were all huddled in the doorway of the balcony now, leaning on one another and squinting to see what was going on. Damon sat on the bed seemingly uninterested with his hand on the hilt of his sword, and his face again bent in thought and overshadowed by his brimmed hat. Lord Marmius stood by the side of the Queen as she made her way down toward the road formed by the soldiers. She would have to pass almost directly beneath them on her way through, and all of them moved back into the room a few paces as she drew closer. As Caleb watched and as the menacing woman drew nearer, time slowed. Queen Tamara struck them all with such an array of emotions and impressions that they were rendered speechless. She was tall, with long flowing dark hair, and possessed undeniable beauty, like a sea in the heart of a vicious storm, piercing Caleb with both awe and fear. Her eyes gazed straight ahead, but he could somehow see that they had a power, some kind of mysterious energy behind them, as if they were distant stars that could penetrate even the most hidden of secrets. She wore black armor of plated mail and chain with steel shoulder guards that ended in high protective walls around her neck. A flowing mantle of a color that looked like blood blew in the sea breeze behind her. She marched forward with her head held high. Elegant and powerful, her face was grim with a silent expression of stone that counted her overwhelming beauty. The lioness. One look at her clearly told that all of the stories of her brutality had to be true. It was not until she was 30 paces from the balcony's shadow that he noticed the weapon at her belt. Just as his father had said, there was the sister sword known as the Chaos. Most of it was black, and as it swayed there on her hip, Caleb saw countless jewels of all colors glittering at him. The handle was dark as well and twisted like a withering vine until it reached the pommel at the end, a large metal object with sharp points jutting upward. The handguard looked no less pleasant. It also resembled rotting vines with thorn-like claws protruding amongst the encrusted jewels. "Fate save us all," Anselm whispered in a quivering voice, revealing to Caleb that he was following a train of thought similar to his own. One glance at his friends, and Caleb could see that all of them were hypnotized by the Queen's macabre supremacy. Just as she came under the balcony, she suddenly looked up. Caleb's heart stopped, and it seemed to him like 1,000 lifetimes passed by as her gaze locked with his. She looked at him with large, penetrating eyes, but her expression remained unchanged, as did her march. It was not until she turned a corner that Caleb was able to come to himself. Fate Almighty! Did she see me? It was then that he noticed Damon had been watching from over his shoulder. The trance in the room burst like a bubble when his voice came loud and clear to them. "Hurry! We must follow her. Quick! While the crowds remain in order." He rushed for the door, and the rest of them shook themselves further out of the spell the vision of Queen Tamara had put on them. Anselm frantically stuffed his ink, pen and records into his satchel, while the others did their best to hastily scoop up their belongings and dash for the door after him.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Episodes go live every Monday and Friday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The audiobook can be purchased in its entirety on Google Play Books. Get the whole trilogy now in both paperback and ebook formats. All links are in the description.